protection. And he's done much more, but I won't enumerate all of it for you now. He presently is an inside agitator in the city of Oakland, where he is the Director of Sustainability. Will you please welcome and remember Randy Hayes.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, please try to remember me in your wills. Many of you in this room I know have met David Brower, and some of you got to know him quite well. I was pissing and moaning about corporations and trying to get them to change at one point in time, and David told me a little story that I just can't and don't want to forget. You know, he said, imagine that there's a lake, and out in the middle of the lake there's this boat, and it's on fire, and it's full of people, and those people don't know how to swim. And you're screaming at them from on shore, hey, get out of the boat, get out of the boat, it's on fire. You know, you're just not going to get a lot of cooperation. But if you pull up next to it with an alternative for them to step onto, you're going to get a lot more cooperation, right? So that to me is a fundamentally important story. We've got to have the alternative to present. And Ross Gelbspan tonight is going to give us a lot of flesh to the bone of that alternative. David also told another story about the great ecological U-turn, or at least he would talk, as well as Joanna Macy and many others, about the great ecological U-turn. And there's a person named Teddy Goldsmith, some of you may know about, who even wrote a book, I think 20 years ago, called, you know, the U-turn. And the U-turn, David Brower's story on that was, if you're standing on the edge of a precipice and you're about to fall off into oblivion, the solution to your dilemma is not that complex. Turn around and go a fundamentally different direction, you know? And a few years ago, when I was in Japan during the negotiations of the Kyoto Protocol, we organized a protest, actually, which was Al Gore, read your book. But that aside for the moment. And he did finally sign it, so good for Al, he read his book. Over there in Kyoto, I realized that despite the faults in the Kyoto Protocol and the Climate Change Convention, it fundamentally represents the great ecological U-turn. If you think about it in terms of, you know, the benchmarking is at 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions, and they're on a linear trajectory getting worse over time, right? But what it says is that also over time, the United States is supposed to get to 7% below 1990 levels by the year 2012. Well, to do that, you've got to fundamentally reverse your direction. So in many respects, solving the climate change problem is that great ecological U-turn that will not only solve that problem, but if we do it right, many other problems hand in hand with it. There's a solution scenario connected to solving this problem called the Apollo Alliance that I also know many of you are familiar with. And it's an alliance of not just environmental groups and the vast diversity of environmental justice and environmental health and other forms of the environmental movement, but it's an alliance with the labor unions and with the business community and with faith communities, and it's a very exciting solution scenario that we all need to get to know better and to get behind. The story of the Apollo project back in 1961, you'll know as well with President Kennedy saying simply, we've got to, you know, the goal is to get to the end of the moon and back by the end of the decade. We don't know how to do it necessarily, but that's the goal, you know, and we need to become sort of a zero emission society. That's the goal, energy and otherwise. We don't necessarily know how to do all of the program of the Apollo Alliance, and I don't have the time tonight to go into the detail, but the website is just apolloalliance.org. But it's a kind of an alliance that really integrates ecology, economy, and social equity considerations. They're talking about generating as much as 3 million new jobs, and not just jobs, but meaningful employment, or what the Buddhists like to say is right livelihood through that process. And you've got advisors to the Apollo Alliance, people from like the United Steelworkers and the Sierra Club and Jesse Jackson and our state treasurer, Phil Angelides, and a diversity of other kinds of people all working together to really make this happen. But for it to really happen, and some of what I feel like I've learned in the last couple of decades of internal and external activism and agitation, is that at the international level, through the United Nations and the international conventions, be it the Climate Change Convention or the Biodiversity Convention, we just simply know that it's not getting the job done. Now, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't give up on those processes, but it alone is not getting the job done. And we certainly know that national governments, in the late 60s, we knew that fundamental to building a sustainable society is how you power it. And don't power it with non-renewable resources. Power it with renewable resources. That's not very complex. We had that figured out at the end of the 60s, but national governments aren't getting that job done either. So if you can't solve the problem at the international level and you can't solve the problem at the national level, and it's not just the United States in terms of national governments, it's Denmark, it's Argentina, it's Indonesia, it's worldwide. National governments are not rising to shoulder their, not rising to the occasion to shoulder their responsibility to solve these problems, then we've got to take it into our own hands locally, and we can do that. And that to me is really very exciting. There are really heroic efforts going on right here in Northern California, the home of John Muir and David Brower and so many others. I won't go into the details of them, but be it Sonoma County that we'll hear a little bit about, right here in Marin County with the update of the general plan, San Francisco and some of their heroic work, and Oakland and other communities throughout the Bay Area. We're raising hundreds of millions of dollars in energy efficiency bonds and solar bonds. We're looking at megawatt shaving plans through energy efficiency in a lot of these communities. Tide power, you could put the equivalent of 3 giant coal-fired power plants underneath the Golden Gate Bridge to harness the power of the tide there. We could power the entire Bay Area from just the bay itself with renewable energy. There's community choice aggregation we're going to hear about, where we can disconnect from these utility companies who haven't shouldered their responsibilities. And we're looking at targets and timelines, the very specific things the United States government fought against at the last UN Earth Summit in South Africa. We're looking at things like, can we achieve 40%, maybe 50% of our electricity renewably by the year 2017? Can we get to 75% reduction of waste to our landfills, which is very much an energy issue, energy-related issue as well, by 2010? And zero waste by 2020. Can we get to 100% renewable electricity by the year 2030? San Francisco has designed such a program to do that, and Oakland is working on one right now as well. Can we double mass transit in some communities, quadruple it by the year 2040? And can we achieve not a 7% reduction of greenhouse gases that the Kyoto Protocol calls for, but can we achieve a 70% reduction of greenhouse gases by the year 2050? Because that is what the scientists, though Ross may give us an update on that, now that's what they're saying is commensurate with the scale of the problem. And I think that we can pilot that right here in Northern California in the Bay Area. And not only begin to do that really methodically and systematically ourselves, but some of you may know, many of you may not know, that in the summer of this coming year, June of 2005, the communities of Northern California have invited the mayors of the 100 largest cities of the world to come to a 5-day Green City Symposium, at the culmination of which, this will be June 1 to 5, here in San Francisco, and with events throughout the Bay Area. Culminating on June 5th, World Environment Day, UN World Environment Day. We celebrate Earth Day, the rest of the world does a different day. There's not too unexpected there. But at any rate, on June 5th, it'll culminate in the 60-year anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter, which, as you know, was signed here in San Francisco in the Bay Area some 60 years ago. And also the signing of the Northern California Urban Environmental Accords, where we'll be looking at working with cities around the world to set these kinds of high common denominators. Because if we can't get the job done at the international level or at the national level, then our communities will take charge of that, and we will work synergistically with the communities throughout the world. If you look at just the mayors of the 100 largest cities of the world, 20 of those cities are from China. 10 of them, I'm rounding off a bit, 10 of them are from India, 10 of them are from Indonesia, 10 of them are from Brazil. That's about 50 of the cities there, and all 100 cities represent 20% of humanity. 2004, this very year, marks the year, the first year in human history where more people now live in urban areas than rural areas. So urban areas are the place to deliver the solutions. And if we can continue to get our communities to rise up, shoulder this responsibility, doing it in a systematic way and working with the communities and cities throughout the world, we'll get the job done. We'll orchestrate that great ecological U-turn, and we will build that socially just, better world in our lifetimes. Thank you.
Randy Hayes, thank you very much. And finally in this section, I'd like to introduce the coordinator of Sonoma County's Climate Protection Campaign, Ann Hancock.
Good evening. These are two of the people who work on climate protection in Sonoma County. Working on climate protection is very, very cool. Sonoma has a challenge for the County of Marin. We challenge you to get all your cities signed up, pledged to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by the end of 2005. You've already done the county, Fairfax, San Anselmo, and Novato, so 7 more. That's your challenge. The Climate Protection Campaign helps Sonoma County get 100% of its municipalities, the county, and 9 cities pledged to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and this was a national precedent, as many of you know. We did this in less time and with more support than anybody thought possible. And Mike Sandler, a very, very cool guy, played a key role in making this happen. We follow Cities for Climate Protection, a global program of over 600 local governments proving that local action moves the world. One result of our work is attracting hundreds of thousands of dollars in technical assistance to help Sonoma municipalities become more energy efficient. The California Public Utilities Commission calls the climate work Sonoma is doing pathfinding. Another project of our campaign with support from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, thank you, Mark, is an inventory of all Sonoma's greenhouse gas emissions: electricity, natural gas, transportation, agriculture, and solid waste. Between 1990 and 2000, Sonoma's greenhouse gas emissions increased 28%, a rate double the rest of the nation. We compared emissions from Sonoma, San Francisco, and Marin. Sonoma produces about 8 tons of greenhouse gas per person per year. San Francisco about 9 tons, and Marin County about 13 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per person per year.
It's the cows.
It's the cows. Yeah.
West Marin.
Yeah, it's the cows. Our challenge is clear, and tonight's speakers make this point indelible on our hearts and minds. My boss is the future generation, and that boss just does not let me go. Mike says that his boss is the fish and the other critters with whom we share the planet. Ask yourself, who's your boss? The motto of the Climate Protection Campaign is big vision, bold action. We want to know, does big vision, bold action speak to you? Let's hear it. Does big vision, bold action speak to you? All right then, be cool and let's rock this world.
I like the attitude. I just got word that AAA is here. Apparently there is a Hummer in the parking lot with 4 flat tires. Anybody brave enough to claim it? Our next speaker is the author of California's Community Choice Law, Assembly Bill 117, sponsored by the new state senator representing Marin, Carol Migden, signed into law in 2002. He has written similar laws in Ohio, New Jersey, Massachusetts since the early 90s, and he's the nation's leading expert on this policy. He also wrote San Francisco's voter-approved 2001 solar bond, the H-Bond Authority, as enhancement of community choice in order to facilitate a cost-effective means for community choice aggregations to develop new renewable energy and conservation facilities rather than just buying power, as has been the case in other states. Most recently, he wrote San Francisco's unanimously approved 2004 Energy Independence Ordinance, combining the city's aggregation authority with its H-bond financing to facilitate a new form of green public works project. He's also an active participant with state agencies involved with community choice, particularly the California Public Utilities Commission's community choice and electric utility procurement proceedings, as well as the California Independent System Operator and California Energy Commission. He's a consultant to Sacramento Municipal Utilities District in designing new photovoltaics commercialization program. He is also executive director of Oakland-based Local Power, co-chair of the California Sierra Club Energy Committee. He has a master's from the University of Chicago, and I'd like you to welcome Paul Fenn.
Thank you. In the 19th century, starting in the 1830s, but lasting all the way through the 1860s, just after the Civil War, there were a series of cholera epidemics in the United States, which were devastating to the emerging urban areas of the East Coast. Over the course of those decades, a vigorous debate took place about the disease, during which time an acceptance of the idea of contagious theory was a major step in the public consciousness. The contagious theory of disease had been considered anachronistic since the time of the Greeks and was received with great skepticism among the scientific establishment. At the same time, as English and American scientists began to study the spread of the disease in the 1840s and 50s, in particular the English scientist John Snow, whose research identified linkages in the water supply that had spread the disease, the debate intensified with the emergence of proposals to create municipal health boards. And in particular, in the city of New York, where the first municipal health board was created, a violent debate took place around the subject of installing municipal water and sewer systems. In particular, such systems required the condemnation of private property, the crossing of backyards, the linking of homes and businesses. That was received very coldly by the commercial establishments of the time and was regarded as a threatening form of emerging communism. We laugh today because everyone has a toilet and we don't consider it to be political having a toilet. And yet at the time it was intensely political and very threatening and took decades to resolve. And the death tolls, as the death tolls mounted, rioting took place in the city of New York. And through an emerging political insistence of the public, in particular the poor, the Metropolitan Health Board was created. It did condemn properties. It did build sewer systems. And today, everyone has a toilet. The problem we face today, and which Mr. Gelbspan will address shortly, is in some ways far more profound because it is caused by humans. It's not simply a life form that emerged among humans, but instead is potentially an irreversible process, far more severe in terms of its long-term impact, far more grave in terms of how it might change our lives. And yet the nature of the debate as it's occurring is very similar and reminiscent of the debates of the 1860s. The same arguments come forward about how private individuals should solve the problem. Voluntary approaches are more appropriate. An objection to the role of government extending its hand into the private sector. A waiting for that private thing to happen. And yet, a look at what must happen in order to reverse the processes that have been identified reveal immediately that a private approach will never achieve the desired result. Most scientists today do consider the Kyoto Treaty target of 7% reduction for the United States from 1990 levels to be wholly inadequate. And as Randy Hayes mentioned, a 70% reduction by 2050 is now considered to be the necessary reduction. But let's look at the Kyoto reduction. Consider it a minimum measure. What would be necessary in order to achieve a 7% reduction? There are three sectors that contribute to global warming. The first, transportation. It can be subject to a certain degree of public policy, but everyone owns the cars that they own. Change in the transportation sector is inherently incremental. It can occur over several decades, potentially, if the political will is there at the state and federal levels. Industry, transportation accounts for 1/3 of the gases. Industry accounts for another third. The industry has been subject to Clean Air Act and federal regulations for the last 20 years. Many changes have already been achieved over that period of time. So again, among industry, improvements or reductions in greenhouse gases are inherently incremental. The third sector, electricity industry, accounts for the last third. Unlike the other two industries, a relatively few power plants cause the problem. You can count them. In 10 minutes, you could count the power plants in the United States. And in 10 or 20 years, you could replace all the power plants in the United States. And were you to do that, you would indeed achieve a 30% reduction across the board, potentially in a relatively short period of time. So if we accept the premise that dramatic reductions are necessary, then we must insist, as a matter of principle, on the achievement of scaled reductions, not merely reductions, not merely a commitment to solar power, but a commitment to scaled solar power. Now, what kind of scale are we talking about? In San Francisco, last May, the Board of Supervisors approved what remains the largest commitment, public municipal commitment to green power that has yet been made. They have committed to a regime under which the city will build 360 megawatts of solar power, wind power, distributed generation, conservation, and energy efficiency. Now, 360 megawatts is enough power to electrify 360,000 homes. The city of San Francisco collectively requires between 650 megawatts and 920 megawatts at any time. And so, in effect, they will remove 360 out of 650 to 920. This should be achievable within 3 years. The effect of that new infrastructure in San Francisco will be to remove somewhere in the area of 7%, not from 1990 levels, but from current levels across the board in San Francisco for that air shed taken as a whole. So it's really, from the point of view of the big picture, which we'll hear about next, it's a minimal measure that they're taking in San Francisco. And yet, it is exponentially larger than anything that's ever been proposed before, at least in the United States. We have aggressive federal programs in Europe, but in the United States, it's really off the charts. Now, what facilitated that was partly political will at the local level and leadership, continuous leadership over a 5-year period, a genuine commitment, and a radicalized local city council. And yet, what we now have in California just in the last 6 months, as a result, again, of prolonged activism over years, is a move by many jurisdictions to follow suit with similar plans. In fact, the County of Marin, through the leadership of the Board of Supervisors, Hal Brown, and local activist Rebecca Collins, with the support of really hundreds of people, has signed on to the goal of a 40% renewable portfolio standard within its electricity service. 40% is somewhere near, it's not quite as aggressive as the San Francisco plan, but again, it would achieve somewhere around a 7% reduction from current levels. Recently, a study commissioned by the county in conjunction with a number of other counties and cities in California came back with a very encouraging result, namely that provided that community choice aggregation in conjunction with the use of solar bonds is used, that this 40% standard can be built not only here in Marin, but in Oakland, Richmond, Berkeley, Emeryville, Vallejo, Pleasanton, Los Angeles County, San Diego County, Beverly Hills, West Hollywood, San Marcos, with no rate increase. Now, we've heard several speakers say something very important, which is the notion that we don't have to choose between the climate and prosperity. We've been given this choice for decades. It's the choice that Vice President Cheney gave us in his energy plan. And it's a choice that most of us accept more or less implicitly. But it's a choice that, if made, inevitably favors prosperity. No politician will sell prosperity to the environment. But what we've found is that through the assertion of local political authority, not through voluntarism, not through goodwill, but through local political authority, through the scale that can be achieved through that authority, in the same way that the New York Metropolitan Health Board asserted the same scale in building the sewer systems of New York in the 1870s, that assertion of purchasing power through local authority, low interest financing, the use of bonds, the same kinds of bonds used to build bridges and hospitals and public parking garages and highways, the railroads, etc. This is really that order of commitment that's needed. We can't go on with the general drift, a general drift toward sustainability versus a drift away from it. We must assert a minimum standard, a minimum scale, and it must involve local government